Okay, we'll get it going. So welcome to the third session of the first day of our MS4 forum. My name is Jason Wright. I'll be moderating this session and I'll go ahead and get us going. So we're gonna start again, begin by thanking the presenters. We appreciate Bruce and Adrian taking the time to tell us about some of their experiences. So our goal here for this event was to develop and focus on the permittee experience. So as they work to meet the conditions of the Pennsylvania MS4 permit. And so we appreciate them taking the time and them volunteering to share their information and their perspective as they've worked to implement their 6 minimum measures. So I know you've heard it already in the last two sessions, but we'll say it again that throughout these 2 days of the presentations and information that they're offered as part of this MS4 forum, they are the views and experiences of the organizations presenting. The EPA and the Pennsylvania DEP do not endorse any one approach or funding strategy. The views and opinions expressed by the speakers and their organizations are their own and do not reflect those of the EPA or the Pennsylvania DEP. So particularly any mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not indicate an EPA or Pennsylvania DEP endorsement. So we got that out of the way again, and as far as the question and answers go, I'm sure it's been held as far as the other forums are concerned. If you want to put any questions or comments that you may have in the chat box, you can also feel free. I think there's some hand clapping emojis. I know it's can be interesting to present to a computer screen, so I'm sure Bruce and Adrian would appreciate any feedback. Like I said, there's emojis for hand clapping, hand raising. I think there's a heart in there somewhere that you can throw out if you'd like, just to show some communication and engagement. And then if you do have a question, feel free to put that in the chat box. We'll get to it as quick as we can. And if there's a question that's too much for typing, you can raise your hand there, and we'll make sure you get in as well. So though we can have a few of those through the presentation, and then we'll have time. Should have some time for some question and answer at the end, where we can come off mute and share your video and ask some questions if you like. So we'll get into it now. We're going to hear a little bit about forming a stormwater utility in Camp Hill Borough, Cumberland County. So with that, Bruce and Adrian, if you'd like to introduce yourselves, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Bruce and I are excited to spend the next half hour with you discussing the Borough of Camp Hill and the process that they went through to implement a stormwater utility. And one of the reasons that I'm excited to be discussing Camp Hill is that they're a really great example as to why a stormwater utility is a much more sustainable way to fund stormwater management, and how stormwater fees increase the financial viability of the municipality. Camp Hill chose to implement their fee in 2020 during COVID. And as part of setting up that stormwater utility, they shifted stormwater and a portion of associated pavement management costs out of their general fund budget, which amounted to about 15% of their typical annual expenses. Just so happened that tax revenue was down 15% due to COVID. So taking aside the startup subsidy, the borough was able to wind up revenue neutral during the pandemic by implementing a stormwater fee last year. So a little background, before we get started, Bruce Holsheiser and I both represent Herbert Rowland and Grubik. HRG is a civil engineering firm providing consulting services to municipal and county government, as well as the private sector. We've been able to do that for over 57 years. With over 250 employees in 10 offices, we serve well over 100 MS4 clients throughout the Commonwealth. And we're really excited to have been named by Engineering News Record as the Mid-Atlantic Design Firm of the Year. Bruce and I are both engineers in HRG's Financial Services Division, where we help sustain municipalities, counties, and authorities through a variety of financial solutions. As part of that work, we've implemented stormwater fees benefiting over 50 municipalities in Pennsylvania and are actively working with over 150 municipalities on regional stormwater management solutions. So to get into our presentation today, why did Camp Hill decide to consider a stormwater fee? Well, the borough was facing an increased number of stormwater challenges, including field infrastructure, flooding, in addition to increased MS4 permit regulations, and the need to fund best management practices. So the cost of stormwater management was outpacing their general fund revenue. Borough Council and management staff found themselves at a similar place to where they were back in the 1990s. Back then, the regulatory burden and the cost of wastewater management exceeded their ability to pay for wastewater through taxes. So in 1994, the borough implemented a wastewater fee because it provided a dedicated revenue stream for wastewater service costs. And that was found to be more equitable for their residents. So over the past few years, the borough found themselves at a very similar point with stormwater service. So some of the benefits that borough staff saw with implementing a stormwater fee included having a dedicated source of stormwater funding to more proactively maintain, repair, and replace stormwater infrastructure, rather than dealing with infrastructure on a more costly emergency repair basis, which is what they had been doing in recent years. And they also saw a benefit of using a portion of that stormwater fee revenue to better manage associated pavement cost as well. They felt that stormwater fees allocated stormwater costs more fairly to property owners than tax assessment. And with a fee, cost to property owners would not be based on property value, and all developed properties would pay, even those that were tax exempt within the borough. And that was resulting in a savings to the residential property owners of 40%, which we'll discuss more in a few minutes. For property owners that make improvements to their property to manage stormwater, the borough offers a credit, and they've seen that that really provides an incentive for property owners to collaborate with them on stormwater management. And the stormwater fee, as I mentioned before, provides financial relief to the borough's general fund budget. And Borough Council felt that all of this sets the stage to better meet growing funding needs relative to stormwater, including those due to evolving MS4 regulations. So these pictures depict some of the stormwater problems facing the borough, including eroding stream banks and associated sediment and other water quality pollution issues, capacity problems in their stormwater infrastructure leading to flooding of roadways and private property. The picture on the bottom middle of the slide shows a cracked stormwater pipe in threat of collapse, and that pipe happens to run under a building structure. So prior to enacting a fee, the borough simply didn't have the revenue to dedicate to addressing these rather significant issues that it's in Pennsylvania, there is currently enabling legislation for municipal authorities and second-class townships to charge a fee for stormwater service. Home rule municipalities can also charge a fee as long as it's not prohibited through their charter or other legislation. In 2015 and 2017, legislation was put before the House and Senate to enable first-class townships and boroughs to charge stormwater fees. And unfortunately, that legislation failed to go through, and it has not currently been reintroduced. So that means that boroughs won't have the ability to directly charge a stormwater fee within the next 2 years. The earliest would probably be 3 to 4 years from now if it's reintroduced in 2023 and it's passed. So what have other boroughs done? Well, some like Clarion Borough chose to form a new stormwater authority or to expand an existing stormwater authority to also, or excuse me, an existing wastewater authority to also manage stormwater. We've had 20 or more borough clients that have joined regional authorities for stormwater management. And there's also been a few boroughs like Greenville in the western part of the Commonwealth who directly implemented a fee under the borough. However, it's worthwhile to note that Greenville is currently pursuing and maybe by now has obtained their home rule charter status. In order to ensure the legal ability to charge a stormwater fee, Camp Hill chose to implement a new authority. More specifically, Borough Council decided to form an authority to manage stormwater initially, but which also could be expanded easily in the future to take on wastewater responsibilities. To date, they've been managing wastewater directly under the borough as a borough utility, but they wanted the ability to transfer the stormwater management responsibilities over to the newly formed authority at some point in the future. They were also interested in adopting a capital improvement plan and evaluating taking on multiple borrowings to fund larger stormwater projects through debt service, since they could now self-liquidate the debt through a stormwater fee. They were willing to provide a startup subsidy to the authority in order to keep the fee at an affordable level for property owners, and they desired a planned public education approach that included public meetings. So this is an overview of their implementation process they went through. They commissioned their own flight and used aerial orthophotography to develop impervious area estimates for each parcel within the borough. They also formed a stakeholder advisory committee, which met, I believe, 8 times throughout the course of implementation. HRG teamed with the public works staff to develop a complete full needs assessment over a 10-year period of time and use that to develop a budget and capital improvement plan, which included stormwater and related pavement management costs. Fee structures and credit policy options were evaluated. Since they had high quality impervious area estimates, they were able to consider a number of different fee structures and to determine which one would be the best fit for the types of properties within the borough. And they went through the legal process of establishing a new authority, implementing a public education campaign, and recommendations were then made to both Borough Council and the Authority Board on the fee structure and associated fee magnitude. So the borough consists of about 17 miles of stormwater pipes and culverts with over 750 structures that include inlets, manholes, and outfalls. Due to the age of the borough's infrastructure and the associated condition, much of it is due to reach the end of its useful life over the next 5 to 20 years. So there's a lot of capital improvement needs that are out there. And that capital plan identified necessary projects throughout the borough. Many were assumed to be funded by debt as opposed to their previous pay-go approach. And they wanted to keep it open in order to look at funding through a variety of different type of lenders. And due to the manner in which Penvest determines their funding awards, it was important for all the costs related to stormwater management to be put in the budget to support getting the best funding offer possible through some of those government subsidized funding options. So relative to that, yes.
Sorry, we do have a quick question.
Sure.
And that is a lot of feedback. As you engage the stakeholder advisory committee, did you experience any pushback? If you did, how did you address that?
I think in general, the stakeholder advisory committee was a really good group of people because they are a subset of all the different property owners, throughout the committee. So we had, some residential property owners. There were property owners from various types of tax exempt properties like the school district, churches, the library. They also were commercial businesses as well. And I would say from my point of view, we had the most kind of pushback from those tax exempt property owners. They hadn't been paying for stormwater. But before switching from funding from taxes to a stormwater fee meant they would need to start paying. And I think the stakeholder group was a really great opportunity to engage in a dialogue with them. And we actually had several of them become champions in the community. We had, some of the tax exempt property owners look at putting in permeable pavement to reduce their amount of impervious area. We also had stakeholder advisory committee members actually, really choose to step up and be champions in the community. So as we had public meetings, those stakeholder committee members, they actually presented part of the meeting content. So basically it was other people in the community kind of presenting to their fellow community as to the benefits and the need for the stormwater fee. And so I think their involvement to that level really helped the rest of the property owners better understand why the borough was doing what it was doing and what the benefits were. Bruce, is there anything else that you would have to add on that?
I'll just reiterate what you said about the Stakeholder Advisory Committee members over time becoming advocates. That's the goal, one of the goals of the Stakeholder Advisory Committee members. I'm happy to report that it was another Bruce, since there's few of us out there, you know, so I was glad that there was another Bruce that actually started our public meeting, a borough resident, and just communicated from the local perspective. It wasn't just HRG coming in and saying, hey, this is a good idea. It was a borough resident who was going to be paying the fee saying, this is something we really need to do and address.
That's a great question that was asked. Jason, are there any more before we go on to the next slide?
No, that's the only question so far.
Great. So, relative to the annual budget, it included items such as street sweeping, leaf collection, graded inlet cleaning, pipe flushing, condition assessment, GIS mapping, contracted and in-house repairs, MS4 requirements, and the like. The average revenue need for the first few years of the program was found to be $865,000 per year, which included $3.1 million in initial capital projects and $150,000 per year in repairs directly funded through rate revenue, or PAYGO. Council felt that the resulting stormwater fee, considering all those costs, was too high for property owners. So they decided to provide a startup subsidy for initial years of $350,000 per year to get the fee down to $10 per month for the average residential property owner. This slide demonstrates why charging a stormwater fee in place of funding stormwater through taxes is more equitable for the residential property owner. So the orange bars represent the percent of taxable assessed value that are attributable to the various types of property owners in the community, whereas the blue shows the percentage of impervious area. And empirical studies have shown that impervious area is the best correlation to the quantity of stormwater leaving a property or the quality of stormwater leaving a property. So you can see that when we look at the percentage of impervious area, residential property owners make up 53% of the impervious area in the municipality, but in terms of assessed property value, they make up 74% of assessed property value. So in the past, with stormwater being funded by taxes, residential property owners were faced with paying 74% of the cost, even though they only contribute 53% of the stormwater. So in paying through taxes, those residential customers were paying 40% more than their share of the cost. This slide also shows tax-exempt properties. They make up 12% of the impervious area in the borough, but prior to the fee being enacted, they currently didn't pay towards stormwater. So paying through taxes was found to not be equitable for the borough. It was shifting costs to residents. And so making that switch over to a stormwater fee more accurately allocated cost to the property that were contributing to stormwater and water quality pollution. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Bruce to discuss ways in which the borough works to gain community support.
Thanks. I'll mention that graphic. I'll stop talking and try again. I'll mention that graphic that Adrian was just showing has been very useful. It varies by municipality, but it's been very useful in public meetings. Something like that illustrates that it's actually favorable to residential property owners to be charged a stormwater fee. That's kind of hard to comprehend, but once something like this is presented, and we realize that there's real cost to a stormwater program, stormwater management program, those costs have to be covered by something. They're either covered by property taxes, where the taxable assessed value gets shifted more to the residential property owners. I can remember one in a different community, another community at a public meeting, a man coming in with fire in his eyes. He evidently was going to rip someone's head off. And once I came to this slide, he seemed to calm down, and I don't recall that he even made any comments during the meeting. So it's very helpful that the costs are being allocated more equitably, more appropriate, that a benefit being realized by distributing the cost through a fee, which uses impervious area as the metric rather than taxable assessed value. If I had a couple acre property with a parking lot or a 5-story building, the assessed value is very different, even though the benefit being realized from the stormwater program is equal. Okay, we can move forward then, Adrian, and happy to accept any other questions as we go forward. So the question was already raised about the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. It's really the first level of attack, if you will, of trying to gain community support. So we're being honest with our Stakeholder Advisory Committee members as well. We're inviting them, the people that might be affected the most, like the tax exempt properties or the large commercial or industrial properties, that we ask them to be part of this committee. The committee not only becomes advocates because they can understand that we have real needs, regulatory needs, infrastructure needs, program needs that are more than just projects. As they begin to understand that, they can become advocates. Not only do they become advocates, but they also can give some helpful feedback. In the case of Camp Hill, I can recall some very helpful feedback about what credits to include, for example, in the credit policy. Rather than them coming in later after we're already done and settled and adopted, they're providing information and feedback about real situations like permeable paving, for example, was brought up at the committee level that can help guide the program forward. You can go forward. The impervious area is the most common metric used for stormwater utilities throughout the United States, as well as in Pennsylvania. So not all impervious area is created equal. In one case, in Camp Hill, there was some houses that were demoed. Perhaps some of you are familiar with those houses, because it was a relatively famous intersection. And they were demoed after we had done a flight for the impervious area. So the impervious area needed to get updated then after our flight. And so you compare the flight that we had done for impervious area versus other publicly available flights, and you find that there really is a significant difference in the precision of them. So the Camp Hill wisely decided to go ahead and have this flight done, and that illustrated the value of that. Down the bottom there, we note about the billing database integration. Because Camp Hill chose to bill through their sanitary sewer billing, so they added the stormwater fee on the sanitary sewer bill, which is commonly done and even recommended. That meant we needed to integrate the two data sources. The stormwater data was coming from parcel data from the county. The sanitary sewer data, of course, was in a database for their billing. And addresses aren't always said the same way, right? Street might be written out or not be written out. There's typos, et cetera. So there's a decent amount of effort getting near the end here of making these two data sources speak to one another. So something to keep in mind as you're implementing the process. Okay, you can go forward. The fee structure. So there's different fee structures that different communities choose to use. A familiar structure is the ERU structure, which would be similar to in sanitary sewer, the EDU structure, where you're saying a residential property, we're going to find out the average of what the residential property is. We'll call them an ERU. So the average impervious area for the residential property classes. Class gets established, and that average is the basis for the fee that all residential properties charge, a flat fee for residential. In Camp Hill's case, they chose not to do so. This graphic, there's a bell curve of sorts there that shows the properties and their impervious area. This is regardless of whether they're residential or commercial or otherwise. So the majority of properties, in fact, 93% of them are 7,500 square foot of impervious area or less. What Camp Hill chose to do is divide that group of properties into 3 tiers, and then have properties that had more impervious area over 7,500 square feet just pay per 1,000 square foot of IA. whereas there's just 3 types of payments. If you're a smaller property, IA-wise, impervious area-wise, you pay the $570. If you're an average, you pay the $10. Now, this is regardless of whether you're residential or commercial. One of the benefits of that is that we don't need to get into the weeds of the land use. What if a house first floor was converted into a pizza shop, the second floor is an apartment? How does that change the benefit that property is realizing from the stormwater program? It didn't change the impervious area at all. So why would it be treated different? And so the borough and the stakeholder advisory committee provided input on this, chose to say, well, we're not going to make a distinction about whether they're residential or not residential. We're not going to have to deal with some of the nuances of that, which can get relatively complicated, but we'll just group them into these tiers. Now, rather than just doing a straight line of per 100 square foot or per 1,000 square foot, by grouping into tiers, similar properties would pay similar amounts. So most likely your neighbor is paying the $10 if you're paying the $10. And so the billing gets simplified a bit by doing that. Next slide.
Hey, Bruce, we do have one question.
Okay.
It says, how do you assign credits to residential properties that have already installed stormwater BMPs on their property to meet ordinance requirements for the installation of impervious surface?
Okay, can I table that one? Because we're going to get the credits in a minute, and we'll come back around. That'll probably make the most sense.
And this is probably related, but the question is, are there any properties that are not paying fees? Anybody exempt as non-contributors? Grassed fields?
Yeah, that one I should answer now. Adrian, can you go back one slide?
Sure.
That one could argue there's a tier 0, which would be the properties on the far left of that graph, which are below 500 square foot of impervious area. So they're considered undeveloped if they have, just a shed on the property there. So yes, they would not be paying the fee. That would be the exempt, if you will, properties. Okay, so let's move forward because time flies when you're having fun. Here's a couple examples of property owners. Just look at Church 1 and Church 2 to illustrate the idea of equitability of a fee. One church has significantly more benefit being realized from the stormwater program. If you look at impervious areas, the metric of that. And so Church 1 pays $68 per month, whereas Church 2 pays $328 per month. Next slide. So the fee structure, we've mentioned these here before. I'm just going to mention the last item, which some communities have chosen to do a starter flat fee that maybe is based on you just have a sanitary sewer connection. Camp Hill did not choose to do that. Sometimes that can lead to some challenges where there's a jump in the fee when you shift from just a flat fee to an impervious area based fee, particularly for commercial or industrial properties, and even the tax exempt properties as well. Next. So getting to the credits and the question that was asked about the credits. So this slide is representing a variety of credits, not all of which were adopted by Camp Hill. So non-urbanized parcel credit was not applicable. A low impact parcel credit really wasn't applicable because of the borough situation. But in more township situations, that becomes a little bit more relevant to consider that there's some properties that are either outside the urbanized area or that are kind of on the fringe of things and have a lot of grass. But the structural BMP, so if there's a existing best management practice in place, say an infiltration basin, a credit could be applied for by the property owner and granted. Now we tie the credit percentage to the budget. This is an important concept that we tie how much of a credit. You don't just pick a percentage and say, if you have a structural BMP, we'll give you 10%. No, we look at the budget and say, what part of the budget, annual budget, is related to rate and volume control? What benefit is that private stormwater management system providing to the overall program? And so in the case of Camp Hill, that was 30%. Now, rain barrels, the stakeholder advisory committee suggested, and the borough and authority went ahead with a recommendation of not making that a credit so much as a rebate. So a homeowner could just get a $30 rebate for having a rain barrel. And the basic logic of this is we don't want to go around and make sure that that rain barrel is empty before the next rain. Because if it's not empty, then it really actually isn't doing anything in the way of rate or volume control. So instead, just encourage this positive stormwater behavior by providing a rebate rather than a 5% credit every month. That was the recommendation of the stakeholder committee. And then we also had provided an education credit. Perhaps we should keep moving. So that's briefly about the credits. We can chat about that a little bit more. We mentioned the first about tying the magnitude of the credit to the budget. We talk about the stormwater management program, not just an MS4 fee. We found that helpful. We can come back to that discussion. The last point, the impervious area shown in this graphic, perhaps those that are familiar in the community would recognize the Veterans Hospital, the VA hospital that isn't there anymore, that now is a commercial development, where the barbecue place is. And so that happened after the flight, but before the fee went in place. So there's some steps that really should be considered right when you're getting to the end of the implementation process, which might take 8 months or 18 months, depending how all the things develop. That there's some data updating you want to do and consider doing at the end to help reduce appeals. If we had just sent out a bill based on this information, it would have led to a whole bunch of work afterwards. So instead, we'll do the work before we actually send out that first bill. Next slide. As to public outreach and public education, like we said, we did the stakeholder advisory committee. Next slide. And then we also made a plan of how to disseminate information through the borough has a newsletter that we progressively gave information about the stormwater program. Then we did public meetings to communicate as well to the community. Next slide. Just running out of time, sorry, friends. So a couple of things we already mentioned, the other Bruce who kicked off that stakeholder advisory committee, which was really fun to see. It doesn't happen in every community, but Camp Hill, it did. One kind of anecdote from Camp Hill was that the library representative didn't live in the borough, and she actually didn't realize she had been paying a stormwater fee for 3 or 4 years over in Derry Township. So it illustrates an idea that sometimes people just pay the fee. If you put it on their sanitary sewer bill, it just went up, $10 a month, and they just keep paying it. That was kind of a fun little anecdote there. We did distinguish it, however, on the bill, the stormwater fee from the wastewater fee. Okay, next slide. So finally, what does the fee address? It addresses, BMPs, it addresses the MS4 requirements, it addresses infrastructure needs, which there are many. Every community that I've worked in and Adrian's worked in have had infrastructure needs. This is like sanitary sewer was in the 70s, that stormwater had been, sanitary sewer had been largely neglected. And so fees were put in place to really address that need. Similarly in stormwater now, that there's much infrastructure that needs a lot of attention. And so we can start moving forward to be more proactive through having the fee. So last slide, and if there's any time for any remaining questions.
Okay, thanks, Bruce and Adrian. We do have one more question coming in on the chat. It's in what different ways did you notify your residents that a public meeting was being held, and how did you get them to come?
Bruce, do you want to take that one?
Right. So the quarterly newsletter would have been a way that a notice was provided. Facebook would have been a way to notify them. I believe for Camp Hill also it was put on the sanitary sewer bill, a notification about that.
We do find that a lot of communities will either put it on the wastewater bill or do a separate mailer prior to the fee going out, just so that there's at least one, direct method of communication that's going to each home, in addition to using just some of the other more general forms of communication throughout the community.
All right. Has Camp Hill given any consideration to collaborating with neighboring communities or parcel owners on managing stormwater?
What I don't actually know the details about related to their pollution reduction plan. If there was any collaboration, I don't believe anything is being done, but whether there's been consideration given, I'm not sure.
I think, one of the benefits we've seen is, when stormwater is funded through taxes, there's really no advantage for property owners, coming on board, no financial advantage for property owners coming on board and partnering with the municipality, because there's no way to lower that tax payment. But when we fund stormwater through a fee and then offer a credit policy, we're seeing that it really does incentivize property owners to be willing to get involved and better manage stormwater on their property. So, we've definitely seen property owners throughout Camp Hill more interested and engaged in installing best management practices. And then Camp Hill is claiming those towards what they're doing under their pollution reduction plan to meeting their permit requirements. So the stormwater fee has been a great way to start more collaboratively working as a community to meet the MS4 needs.
Okay, we can squeeze in one more quick question before we go back to the wrap up or adjournment session. So do you think that doing this on a municipal level is easier than doing it countywide?
I guess I would say that it's typically more streamlined doing it on a municipal level. There aren't as many stakeholders to engage and pull together to actually get it implemented. Implementation typically is quicker on a per municipal level. However, I would say overall the benefits of regional stormwater collaboration far outweigh the additional time that it takes to get the regional solution going. We're just seeing a lot of streamlined costs, both with infrastructure management, definitely with meeting MS4 permit requirements. We have other places throughout the Commonwealth that have implemented regional authorities, and they've demonstrated that it's saving municipalities about 50% on average and saving those property owners 50% on average by paying a regional stormwater fee as paying a fee to their local municipality. Dauphin County is in the process of implementing a county-based approach for any municipalities that are looking to opt in. That's also showing savings of at least 50% over the initial permit term. So in general, I would say there's a lot of benefit to be gained by counties working together or watersheds working together to manage stormwater.
All right. Thank you very much. I think that brings us to the end of the session. So thank you again, Adrian and Bruce, for a great presentation. And we appreciate all of you participating and the great questions. So I think now, as we've been instructed on some of the other sessions, we can leave this session. And I think hopefully Liz will put the link in the chat to go back to the main session. So we do have one more short session to just wrap things up with some parking lot questions and adjournment. So that should be, you can leave this meeting and then follow the link that's in the agenda, and I'll see you over there in that session. All right.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.